Now that we've covered the accounting for both finance and operating leases, and looked at a few complicating factors such as lease incentives and residual value guarantees, let's shift our attention back to subsequent lease accounting. Up to this point, all of our subsequent accounting has focused on the routine monthly entries we make as we move through the lease term. But real-world leases don't always remain static. As time passes, we'll almost inevitably run into situations where something about a lease changes. We may reassess whether we are reasonably certain to exercise an option at the lessee's discretion. Or we may renegotiate with the landlord and agree to new terms, such as extending the lease, changing the payments, or even replacing the underlying asset. Many different situations can arise that require us to reassess or modify a lease. The good news is that ASC 842 provides guidance on how to handle these situations. Broadly speaking, changes fall into two categories. Some require us to remeasure the existing lease, while others are lease modifications that ASC 842 may require us to account for either as an adjustment to the existing lease, or in some cases as a new lease entirely. So over the next couple of episodes, our goal will be to understand which types of changes lead to remeasurement versus modification, and how to think about each. To do that, let's start by looking closely at what the standard says about reassessment by the lessee. Paragraph 842.10.35.1 states that a lessee shall reassess the lease term or an option to purchase the underlying asset only if, and at the point in time that, one of the following occurs. First, there is a significant event or a significant change in circumstances within the lessee's control that directly affects whether the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise an option to extend or terminate the lease or purchase the underlying asset. So before moving to the second item, let's think about this for a moment. When we determine the lease term at commencement, we consider the non-cancelable period along with any periods covered by an option to extend that we are reasonably certain to exercise, or an option to terminate that we are reasonably certain not to exercise. We base this assessment on four factors: contract-based, asset-based, entity-based, and market-based. It's not as simple as management deciding whether they feel confident about exercising an option. The analysis must reflect economic incentive based on those four factors. A similar idea applies when reassessing the lease term after commencement. When significant events or changes in circumstances within the lessee's control occur that directly affect whether the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise an option to extend or terminate the lease, we must reassess the lease term. ASC 842 gives examples in paragraph 842.10.55.28, which include constructing significant leasehold improvements expected to have significant value when an option becomes exercisable, making significant modifications to the underlying asset, making a business decision directly relevant to exercising an option, or subleasing the underlying asset for a period that extends beyond the option date. For example, if Precision Industrial leases a warehouse and a vehicle for the same term and decides to exercise an option to extend the warehouse lease, this may create significant economic incentive to extend the vehicle lease as well. The key point here is that an internal decision by management about whether to exercise an option is not enough to trigger reassessment under ASC 842.10.35.1. The change must have economic substance when we consider all relevant factors. The remaining reassessment triggers are more straightforward. We must reassess the lease term or a purchase option when the contract includes an event that obliges the lessee to exercise or not exercise an option. When the lessee elects to exercise an option even though the entity had previously determined that the lessee was not reasonably certain to do so, and when the lessee elects not to exercise an option even though the entity had previously determined that the lessee was reasonably certain to do so. For example, we may have initially concluded we were not reasonably certain to exercise a renewal option, but then we notify the landlord that we will renew. Or we may have been reasonably certain to renew at commencement, but allow the renewal deadline to pass without renewal. Those situations clearly require a reassessment of the lease term. Now, these 4 events provide an exhaustive list of when reassessment of the lease term or option to purchase the underlying asset is required. And that's an important takeaway. This is an exhaustive list. As we move forward through the lease, we do not have to continually reassess our decisions or our analysis of reasonably certain. We only reassess when one of these defined situations occurs. So that completes the discussion of reassessing the lease term or an option to purchase the underlying asset after the commencement date. But what exactly do we do when we make a reassessment? We'll look at that in the next episode.